Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight we drift into the shadows of the Isdal Woman mystery. Imagine, if you will, the city of Bergen, Norway, in the late autumn of 1970. It is a place where the mountains do not merely surround the city. They loom over it, draped in a perpetual veil of mist and heavy, low-hanging clouds. The air here carries the scent of salt from the North Sea, mingled with the damp, earthy aroma of pine needles and ancient stone. On the 29th of November, the world was a palette of charcoal grays and muted blues. The ground was slick with the residue of a recent rain, the kind of fine, persistent drizzle that clings to your wool coat and numbs the tips of your fingers. In the distance, the peak of Mount Ulriken stood as a silent sentry, its jagged silhouette lost in the fog. This is where our journey begins, in the foothills of that mountain, in a place the locals call Isdalen, the Ice Valley. But through the centuries, it earned a far darker title among those who know its treacherous slopes. They call it the Valley of Death. It is a narrow, steep corridor of scree and brush, where the wind whistles through the crevices like a long, low sigh, and the shadows seem to stretch out with a life of their own. On that Sunday afternoon, a university professor and his two young daughters decided to brave the biting cold for a hike. The father, a man accustomed to the rugged terrain, led the way, his boots crunching over the loose shale and frozen moss. His daughters followed, their breath blooming in small white clouds before the wind carried them away. As they ascended further into the valley, the silence became heavy, almost physical. There were no birds singing in the stunted trees, and the city of Bergen, though only a few miles away, felt as distant as another world. The girls noticed it first, a peculiar smell that did not belong in the crisp mountain air. It was a sharp, chemical odor, the acrid scent of something scorched and sweet, hanging thick in a small clearing tucked between the boulders. They rounded a bend in the path, expecting perhaps to find the remnants of a hiker's campfire or a discarded piece of equipment. Instead, their eyes fell upon a shape that stopped them in their tracks. It was sprawled among the gray rocks, a dark, motionless figure that looked, at first glance, like a shop mannequin that had been cruelly discarded. But as they drew closer, the reality of the sight began to sink in, cold and sharp as an ice shard. The father reached out to pull his daughters back, his heart hammering against his ribs in the sudden, suffocating quiet of the valley. The figure was the charred remains of a woman. She lay on her back in a small, rocky depression, her head pointing downhill toward the city she would never return to. Her body was positioned in what investigators would later describe as the fencer's or boxer's pose, her arms drawn up toward her chest, her fingers curled into tight, defensive fists, as if she were still trying to shield herself from an invisible fire. The flames had been intense, devouring her clothing and leaving her skin blackened and unrecognizable. Most of her face had been erased by the heat, leaving only a haunting silhouette against the damp earth. Yet, as the father looked around the clearing, he realized this was no ordinary accident. There was no signs of a large bonfire, no blackened trees or scorched grass surrounding the body. The fire had been contained, focused almost entirely on the woman herself. Beside her, nestled in the scree, were items that seemed to have been placed with a strange, almost ritualistic precision. A half-empty bottle of St. Halvard liqueur stood upright, its golden liquid shimmering dimly in the afternoon light. Two plastic water bottles, their sides warped and melted by the heat, sat nearby. There was a nylon stocking, a woolen scarf, and a pair of rubber boots. It looked less like a crime scene and more like a carefully arranged altar, a silent collection of a life that was being systematically deleted. As the police arrived hours later, navigating the steep, treacherous path by the light of powerful lanterns, the mystery only deepened. The lead investigator, a man named Carl Halstensen, knelt in the dirt, his gloves brushing against the frozen ground. He noted the way her belongings were scattered, yet deliberately positioned. A watch, a ring, and 2 earrings had been placed next to her body, rather than being worn. It was as if someone had stripped her of her identity before the end. But the most chilling detail was discovered when they examined the few pieces of fabric that had survived the flames. Every single label had been meticulously cut away. The brand names on her coat, the size tags on her silk scarf, even the manufacturer's mark on her matchbox, all gone. Someone had spent a great deal of time with a pair of scissors, ensuring that no thread of evidence would lead back to a store, a city, or a country. Beneath her body, they found a fur hat, and as they lifted it, the smell of petrol wafted up, sharp and unmistakable. The woman had not just burned, she had been ignited. And yet there were no matches in her hand, no lighter nearby that hadn't been touched by the fire. The silence of the Isdal Valley seemed to swallow the investigators' questions, leaving them only with the cold wind and the unblinking eyes of the mountains. The autopsy would later reveal that the woman had died from a combination of carbon monoxide poisoning and a massive overdose of sleeping pills, specifically a brand called Fenimal. Between 50 and 70 tablets were found in her stomach, many of them still undissolved, meaning she had swallowed them shortly before the fire began. Soot was found in her lungs, a haunting proof that she was still breathing as the flames climbed her body. Who was she? Why had she come to this desolate, haunted valley in the dead of a Norwegian winter to meet such a violent, lonely end? As the sun dipped below the horizon on that 29th of November, the police packed their kits and began the long trek back down to Bergen. They carried her body in a zinc coffin, the metal cold and heavy. Behind them, the Valley of Death returned to its natural state, a place of shifting mists and secrets buried under stone. The case, filed under the number 134/70, was only just beginning. But as the city lights flickered to life in the distance, a sense of unease settled over the investigators. They felt, perhaps, that they weren't just looking for a name. They were chasing a ghost who had walked out of the fog and vanished back into it, leaving only the scent of ash and the sound of the wind. Close your eyes now. Let the image of the gray mountains fade. The valley is quiet. You are safe in the warmth of the present. Sleep well. The Isdal Valley, often whispered about by the locals in Bergen as the Ice Valley or even the Valley of Death, does not welcome those who wander into its jagged, rocky embrace. On that cold morning of November 29, 1970, the air was thick with a damp, clinging mist that blurred the edges of the basalt cliffs. The ground, a treacherous carpet of wet moss and loose shale, groaned under the heavy boots of the investigators as they began their grim ascent. There is a specific kind of silence that exists in such a desolate place, a silence that seems to swallow the sound of the wind and the distant cry of a bird, leaving only the rhythmic thrum of one's own heartbeat. As the police reached the remote scree slope, the gray light of the Norwegian winter revealed a scene that defied the natural order of the wilderness. The woman lay wedged between several large boulders, her body positioned in a way that felt stiff and unnatural, as if she had been placed there by a hand that cared more for geometry than for comfort. The smell of the air was a jarring mixture of the fresh, metallic scent of rain and the heavy, cloying stench of burnt plastic and chemical accelerant. It was a place where life should have felt far away. Yet here, in the shadow of the mountains, a final, violent chapter had been written in the frost. As the forensic team knelt beside her, the true strangeness of her final moments began to crystallize. She was found in what the experts call a boxer's position, with her arms pulled tightly against her chest and her hands clenched into small, defiant fists, a common physiological reaction to intense heat. Yet, as they gently examined the remains, a confusing detail emerged. While her front had been charred and blackened by a fierce, localized fire, her back remained almost entirely untouched by the flames. It was as if she had been leaning against the cold stone, or perhaps lying prone, while the fire consumed her from the front alone. The investigators moved with a slow, practiced reverence, their flashlights cutting through the gloom to illuminate the small, mundane items that lay scattered around her. There were 2 plastic water bottles, their surfaces warped and bubbled by the heat, and a small, broken umbrella that lay like a skeletal wing against the dark earth. Nearby, a cheap watch and several pieces of jewelry, a ring and a pair of earrings, were not found on her person. Instead, they had been placed with unsettling precision on a flat rock adjacent to her body. It was a layout that felt less like a struggle and more like a ceremony, a quiet, orderly arrangement that suggested her final acts were performed with a meticulous, perhaps even ritualistic, intentionality. But it was when the officers began to inspect her clothing that the atmosphere truly turned from tragic to terrifying. The woman was dressed for the harsh climate in a blue nylon jacket, a wool sweater, and sturdy rubber boots, yet every single piece of fabric had been subjected to a surgical erasure. As a detective turned over the collar of her coat, he found not a brand name or a size tag, but a clean, raw edge where the label had been carefully snipped away. This was not a case of wear and tear. A sharp blade had been used to remove every single identifying mark from her garments. The tags on her sweater, the labels inside her stockings, and even the branding on the soles of her boots had been methodically cut or scraped off. Each tiny thread left behind whispered of a deliberate attempt to vanish. The investigators' fingers brushed against the rough textures of the wool, searching for a forgotten laundry mark or a hidden name tag, but there was nothing. No store name, no country of origin, no clue to her station in life. It was as if she had emerged from a void, wearing clothes that had never been bought, sold, or manufactured. The sheer effort required to strip a human being of their material history in such a way suggested a level of preparation that went far beyond the actions of a person simply seeking to end their own life. It was the work of someone who understood the value of anonymity. The erasure extended to her belongings as well. The plastic bottles that had held her water were not just empty. Their commercial labels had been painstakingly scraped away until the plastic was clouded and scarred, hiding the brand of the spring water she had chosen to drink. A small bottle of liqueur sat nearby, its glass surface equally anonymous, its contents long gone. Even the matchbox found at the scene, a simple object used to strike a flame, had its surface rubbed clean of any advertisement or location. This woman had walked into the Isdal Valley not as a traveler, but as a ghost in the making. The investigators, seasoned men who had seen the aftermath of many tragedies, found themselves standing in a silence that felt heavier than the mountain itself. They looked at the blue rubber boots, the broken umbrella, and the precisely placed jewelry, and they saw a puzzle where the pieces had been intentionally shaved down so they would never fit together. The wind began to pick up, whistling through the gaps in the rocks, carrying with it the cold promise of snow. They were looking at a woman who had spent her final hours ensuring that, when her heart stopped beating, the world would have no way of calling her by her name. She had scrubbed her life clean, leaving only the charred remains and the chilling question of what could be so terrible that it required the total destruction of an identity. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows across the scree, the forensic team prepared to move the body. Every movement was recorded with the scratch of a pencil on paper, the sound amplified by the stillness of the valley. They noted the traces of petrol found on the fur hat tucked beneath her, a sign that the fire had been fueled by a deliberate hand. They noted the lack of any purse, any wallet, or any document that might tell them where she had come from. She was approximately 30 to 40 years old, with long, brownish-black hair tied back in a simple ponytail with a blue and white ribbon. She was beautiful, even in the stillness of death, yet she was a cipher. The police officers exchanged glances, their breath visible in the freezing air like small, fading spirits. They knew that in a standard investigation, a label on a coat or a brand on a bottle could lead them to a shop, a city, or a family. But here, in the heart of Death Valley, every trail had been cold before it even began. The mystery was not just in how she died, but in the terrifying vacuum of her existence. As they descended the mountain, carrying the woman in a heavy canvas bag, the mist closed in behind them, once again swallowing the site where a woman had worked so hard to become a shadow. The wind that swept through the valley of Isdal did not stop at the mountain's edge. It followed the investigators down into the heart of Bergen, a cold and persistent companion that seemed to whisper of secrets yet uncovered. 3 days had passed since the discovery of the charred remains among the scree, and the investigation had moved from the frozen earth to the echoing halls of the Bergen railway station. The station was a place of constant motion, a transit point for thousands of lives crossing paths for mere seconds. But somewhere within its vast, vaulted interior, 2 brown suitcases sat in a state of unnatural stillness. They had been left in the luggage depot, unclaimed and ignored as the days turned from November into December of 1970. When the police finally turned their keys in the heavy metal locks of the storage area, the air that escaped was stale and heavy with the scent of old leather, and the faint, lingering aroma of something sharp and organic, like garlic or aged paper. These were not the bags of a casual traveler. They were the silent witnesses to a life lived in shadows, and as the clasps were flicked open with a series of metallic snaps, the true scale of the mystery began to unfold. The investigators worked with clinical precision, their gloved fingers lifting each item as if it were a fragile artifact from a lost civilization. The first thing they noticed was the silence of the objects. Usually, a person's belongings speak volumes about their origin, their brand preferences, and their home. But these items had been lobotomized. Every single piece of clothing, from the heavy wool coats to the delicate silk scarves, had been subjected to a meticulous erasure. The labels had been snipped away with surgical accuracy. In some places, you could see the ghost of where a tag had once been, a few stray threads of blue or white silk left behind by a pair of sharp scissors. There were no brand names from Paris, no department store tags from London, and no laundry marks from Berlin. Even the buttons had been checked for identifying engravings. It was a haunting sight, a wardrobe designed to be anonymous, stripped of any history that could tie it to a specific shop or a specific country. The texture of the fabrics was high quality, suggesting a woman of means, yet she had chosen to walk through the world as a ghost, leaving no trail of commerce in her wake. Deep within the folds of a dark blue bubble nylon jacket, the searchers found items that suggested a darker purpose than mere travel. There were multiple wigs, each one meticulously styled in different shades and lengths. One was a deep, midnight black, while another was a softer brown, designed to change the wearer's silhouette and facial framing in a matter of seconds. Beside the wigs lay several pairs of glasses. When the officers held them up to the dim light of the station depot, they realized the lenses were nothing more than plain, non-prescription glass. They were not tools for vision, but tools for disguise, intended to alter the shape of a face and the intensity of a gaze. A partial fingerprint was discovered on the surface of a pair of sunglasses, a smudge of oil and skin that would later prove to be the definitive link between these suitcases and the broken body in the valley. It was the mark of a woman who was constantly shifting, a woman who looked into the mirror and saw a different person every morning. The investigators found themselves staring not at the effects of a victim, but at the kit of an operative, someone who moved through Europe as if it were a stage, and she was the lead in a play with no script. The discovery grew even more surreal as they reached the bottom of the second suitcase. There, nestled among mundane toiletries, was a tube of eczema cream. It should have been a simple clue, a prescription that would lead them to a doctor and a name. But like the clothes, the cream had been scrubbed clean. The label containing the patient's name and the physician's details had been scraped away, leaving only a scarred plastic surface. Nearby, they found 8 silver teaspoons, polished to a dull shine. One bore the distinct mark of a jeweler from Oslo, a small breadcrumb in a forest of shadows. But perhaps most chilling was what lay hidden within the very structure of the luggage itself. Tucked into the lining, carefully concealed behind the fabric backing, were several 100 Deutschmark notes. 5 of them were found in total, crisp and cold to the touch. Along with these were coins from Belgium, Switzerland, Great Britain, and Norway. This was a fortune in various currencies, a liquid hoard that would allow someone to cross borders and change identities without ever needing to visit a bank or leave a digital trace. It was the currency of a life lived on the run, or perhaps a life lived in service to something much larger than a single nation. Finally, at the very bottom of the case, they pulled out a small, unassuming notepad. Its cover was worn, and its pages were filled with a series of cryptic entries written in a neat, firm hand using blue ink. There were strings of letters and numbers that appeared at first glance to be nonsense. Characters like O followed by 22, 08, and then P. To the frustrated detectives, it looked like a code used by a navigator or perhaps a spy. It would take days of grueling intellectual labor to break the cipher, but the truth it revealed was a map of a restless journey. The codes were dates and locations, a diary of movements that spanned the length of Norway and reached out toward the heart of Europe. Each entry represented a stay in a different hotel, a different city, and a different alias. From Trondheim to Stavanger and finally to Bergen, the notepad documented a woman who was always moving, always checking in under a false name, and always paying in cash. As they turned the pages, the investigators realized that the woman in the valley was not just a traveler. She was a ghost who had been haunting the country for months, moving through the cold Norwegian winter with a purpose that remained as locked away as the suitcases once were. The station depot grew quiet as the items were boxed and tagged for the evidence room. The 2 brown suitcases, once just abandoned luggage, had become the centerpiece of a national enigma. Each item removed, the wigs, the plain glasses, the delabeled clothing, and the coded diary, added a new layer of complexity to the woman who died in the Ice Valley. They now knew she was a woman of many faces and many names, a woman who took great care to ensure that if she ever disappeared, no one would be able to find her. She had been successful in her efforts, for even with her belongings laid out before them, the police were no closer to knowing her real name than they had been when they stood over her charred remains. The luggage provided a glimpse into her methods, but it offered no soul, no family, and no history. As the suitcases were wheeled away, the investigation shifted focus once again. They had her things, and they had her movements, but the most important question remained unanswered. Who was she really, and what was she so desperate to hide that she was willing to burn every bridge back to her true self? The investigators sat in a room that smelled of stale coffee and the dry, metallic scent of carbon paper. Outside the windows, the late autumn sky of Bergen was a bruised purple, pressing against the glass. On the long wooden table before them lay a growing mountain of pink and yellow slips. These were the alien registration forms, the mandatory documents that every foreign traveler had to sign upon entering a Norwegian hotel. Each card was a thin, fragile leaf of history, carrying the weight of a person's presence. As the detectives moved their fingers across the paper, they began to realize they were not looking for one woman, but a phantom who lived in the spaces between names. The first thread they pulled was a signature from March 1970. It was elegant, the letters slanted with a practiced grace that suggested a lifetime of fine pens and expensive stationery. The name written in blue ink was Genevieve Lancier. She had arrived at the Hotel Viking in Oslo just as the winter was beginning to lose its grip. The porter remembered her as a woman of quiet authority, wrapped in a coat that whispered of quality, carrying the very same brown suitcases that now sat in the police evidence room. But Genevieve Lancier did not exist. There was no record of her in the winding streets of Leuven, the Belgian city she claimed as her home. She was a ghost who had paid her bill in cash and vanished into the morning mist, only to reappear weeks later under a different sky. The pattern was a slow, rhythmic dance across the map of Norway. From the grand, high-ceilinged lobbies of Oslo to the salt-sprayed docks of Stavanger, she moved with a purpose that remained frustratingly out of reach. In April, she was Claudia Tilt, staying at the Hotel Bristol. The air there was thick with the scent of floor wax and lilies. She sat in the velvet armchairs of the lounge, a woman alone, yet seemingly expectant. Witness accounts began to fill the detectives' notebooks like falling leaves. A maid remembered the way she smelled, a sharp, pungent scent of garlic that seemed to cling to her skin, contrasting strangely with her refined appearance. A waiter recalled the way she moved the furniture in her room, dragging the heavy oak chairs and small tables away from the walls, as if she were searching for something hidden behind the floral wallpaper, or perhaps ensuring that no one could listen through the wood. When she checked out, Claudia Tilt dissolved. In her place, a woman named Vera Jarl arrived in another city, signing her name with the same distinctive line above the letter T, a quirk of handwriting that became her unintended fingerprint. The detectives followed this trail of ink, tracing her through at least 8 different identities. She was Alexia Zarnamershe. She was Elizabeth Lienhauer. She was Fenella Lork. Each name was a new mask, donned in the privacy of a moving train or a locked bathroom stall. Imagine the solitude of those journeys. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels against the iron tracks as she traveled from Trondheim down to the coastal winds of Bergen. She would watch the fjords go by, the water dark and still as glass, reflecting the snow-capped peaks. In the reflection of the window, she might have seen her own face, but which version? In her suitcases, she carried a collection of wigs, dark brown, black, perhaps a silver blonde. Each one changed the shape of her jaw, the depth of her eyes. She wore non-prescription glasses with heavy frames to hide the sharp intelligence of her gaze. At the Hotel Neptune in Bergen, she was remembered for her silence. She would sit in the dining room, her back to the wall, watching the door. The steam from her tea would rise in soft curls, vanishing into the dim light. She spoke French, German, and a broken, hesitant English, her voice low and melodic. One witness recalled seeing her in the company of 2 German naval officers, the conversation hushed and intense, but by the time the police looked for them, they were as gone as she was. She was a master of the middle ground, never staying long enough to become a fixture, but always leaving just enough of a memory to haunt the staff who served her. They remembered her as the woman who changed rooms. In one stay, she moved 3 times, never satisfied with the light or the view, or perhaps simply trying to shake a shadow that only she could see. By October and November, the pace of her movements quickened. The rain in Bergen had become a constant, gray curtain, and the streets were slick with wet cobblestones. She was now Fenella Lork, staying at the Hotel St. Svithun in Stavanger. It was here that she bought the blue rubber boots, the ones that would eventually be found resting near her charred remains in the ice valley. The shopkeeper remembered her as a well-dressed woman who knew exactly what she wanted. She didn't linger over the shelves. She paid, she left, and she stepped out into the cold drizzle. The detectives realized that her travel schedule, decoded from the cryptic notes in her suitcase, aligned perfectly with secret military trials of the Penguin missile. As she moved from hotel to hotel, from Claudia to Vera to Genevieve, she was always within reach of the naval bases, always near the places where the horizon was being watched by radar and steel. Was she a collector of secrets, or a woman caught in a web far larger than herself? The 8 passports she must have carried were never found, likely consumed by the same fire that took her life, leaving only a half-melted plastic cover as a final, taunting clue. She had spent months erasing herself, name by name, until there was nothing left but the wind howling through the valley and a handful of signatures on colorful cards, the only proof that the woman of many names had ever walked the earth at all. The air in Norway during the 1970s did not just hold the chill of the North Sea. It carried the heavy, invisible weight of a continent divided. Beneath the surface of everyday life in Bergen and Stavanger, a silent struggle was unfolding in the shadows. To understand the woman in the valley, one must understand the era of the Cold War, a time when a suitcase full of wigs and a collection of fake passports were not merely the tools of a wanderer, but the tradecraft of a phantom. The world was watching, and Norway, with its jagged coastlines and deep-water fjords, had become a vital chessboard for the powers of the East and the West. Every rustle of a trench coat and every hushed conversation in a hotel lobby felt amplified by the tension of a potential conflict that could ignite at any moment. She moved through this landscape like a ghost in the machinery, her presence always peripheral yet perfectly timed. We find ourselves looking closer at the moments she stepped away from the tourist paths and toward the high-security fences of the Norwegian military, where the stakes were far higher than a simple vacation. The fog that rolled off the mountains seemed to mirror the obfuscation of her true purpose, a veil drawn tight over a life lived in the service of secrets. During that fateful year of 1970, the Norwegian military was deep in the development of a revolutionary weapon known as the Penguin missile. It was a sleek, subsonic anti-ship missile designed to skim the white-capped waves, guided by infrared eyes to its target. This was the crown jewel of Norwegian defense technology, and its testing sites were tucked away in the rocky alcoves of the coast. When investigators later mapped the woman's movements, a chilling pattern emerged, one that the local police initially tried to dismiss as mere coincidence. On the 24th of March, while naval vessels gathered in Bergen for secret trials, she was there, checking into a hotel under a stolen name. In April, as the focus shifted to the waters near Stavanger, she followed, her footsteps echoing on the same piers where the military hardware was being loaded. It happened again in October and once more in November. She was a silent observer to the birth of a weapon that the Soviet Union was desperate to understand. Imagine her standing on a windswept cliff, the salt spray stinging her eyes, watching the gray hulls of the torpedo boats cut through the ink-blue water. The roar of the engines would have vibrated in her chest, a physical manifestation of the power she was perhaps tasked to document. She was not just a traveler, she was a witness to the hidden strength of a nation. The testimonies of those who crossed her path begin to paint a picture of a woman who was much more than a lonely tourist. A fisherman near the Ulsnes naval base remembered a woman fitting her description, standing near the shoreline, her eyes fixed on the restricted movements of the fleet. She didn't have the gear of a hiker or the curiosity of a local. She had the stillness of a predator. In Stavanger, a shoe salesman named Oscar Rortvedt recalled her spending an unusual amount of time selecting a pair of rubber boots, the very same blue boots that would later be found among the charred debris in the ice valley. He noted her calm, cool demeanor and the faint, unmistakable scent of garlic on her breath, a detail that felt strangely intimate amidst the clinical mystery. Even more telling was the account of a military officer who spotted her at a hotel, where she seemed to be observing a group of German naval officers with a professional intensity. She was a woman who knew how to disappear in a crowd, yet her habit of changing rooms and moving furniture in her hotel suites suggested a deep-rooted paranoia, the kind of hypervigilance shared by those who know they are being followed. Her world was one of constant surveillance, where even a shadow on the wall could be a threat, and every locked door was a temporary sanctuary. Perhaps the most damning evidence of her hidden life lay tucked within the lining of her abandoned suitcase, a small, unassuming notepad. At first glance, it appeared to be a jumble of nonsense, a series of letters and numbers like ML 23NM MA or N 030 October K. But to the trained eyes of the Norwegian intelligence service, it was a rudimentary but effective cipher. It was a logbook of her movements, a chronological record of her journeys across Europe and through the coastal towns of Norway. Each entry corresponded to the dates she checked into hotels and the cities she visited, proving that her travel was not random, but calculated. The code was a shield, a way to ensure that if her belongings were ever searched, her itinerary would remain a secret to the uninitiated. Yet, the simplicity of the code has led some to believe she was not a high-level operative of a superpower like the Soviet Union, but perhaps a lower-level courier or an agent for an organization like the Israeli Mossad. In those years, Mossad was active across Europe, hunting for those who had escaped justice after the Second World War. Was she a hunter, or was she the one being hunted? The scratches of her pen on that paper represent the only true diary she left behind, a list of places she had been, and a countdown to the place where she would finally stop. As the investigation deepened, a strange silence began to settle over the case. While the local Bergen police scrambled for answers, the Norwegian Intelligence Service, the PST, seemed to be operating on a different frequency. Files that should have been shared were withheld. Leads that pointed toward espionage were quietly discouraged. The chief of crime investigation, Oscar Hordnes, stood before the press in December of 1970 and declared that there was absolutely no evidence of espionage, a statement that many within his own department found impossible to believe. Behind the scenes, a secret teleprinter message had already been sent from the highest command of the armed forces, linking the woman directly to the Penguin missile tests. There are stories of investigators being told by military colonels to turn their eyes elsewhere, to let the matter rest. This wall of silence suggests a terrifying possibility, that the authorities knew exactly who she was, and that the truth was too dangerous to be made public. In the delicate balance of the Cold War, the death of a single woman was a small price to pay for maintaining the status quo. The intelligence agencies of the world are built on a foundation of professional forgetting. And as the decades passed, the files on the Isdal Woman were buried under layers of bureaucracy and classified stamps. She became a secret kept by the state, a shadow that the light of justice was never permitted to touch. The years turned into decades, and the damp, heavy fog of the Isdalen Valley seemed to swallow the memory of the woman who died among the rocks. For more than 46 years, her story was a ghost story, whispered by those who remembered the strange suitcases at the train station and the smell of smoke in the cold November air. But the world was changing. In the year 2016, the silence was finally broken. Modern science, with its sharp, clinical light, began to peer into the shadows that the old investigation could not penetrate. The case files, once yellowing and brittle in their cardboard boxes, were pulled from the archives. There is a specific kind of stillness in a forensic laboratory, a quiet that feels heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. Scientists in white coats moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their gloved hands touching the remnants of a life that had been meticulously erased. They were no longer looking at the charred scraps of silk or the wigs that sat like hollow shells in evidence bags. They were looking deeper, past the skin, past the bone, into the very atoms that make up a human being. The air in the lab was cool and sterile, smelling of ozone and the faint, sharp scent of chemicals, a stark contrast to the mossy, rain-drenched earth where she was found. Here, in this temple of modern reason, they sought to make the dead woman speak. To find her origin, they looked to her teeth. Enamel is a remarkable thing. It is a microscopic archive of a person's life, a physical record of the water they drank and the soil they walked upon. As a child grows, the elements of the earth are woven into the very fabric of their body. This is the science of isotopes. Scientists focused on oxygen and strontium, tiny chemical signatures that vary from one region of the world to another. They carefully examined the jawbone, which had been preserved in a forensic archive long after the rest of her had been laid to rest. Imagine the precision of the tools, the hum of the machinery as it analyzed the chemical composition of her molars. Each layer of enamel was like a ring in a tree, marking a specific time in her childhood. The results were a revelation. The isotopes whispered of a journey that began far from the fjords of Norway. They suggested she was born around 1930, perhaps a few years earlier or later. Her earliest years were spent in the heart of Europe, likely near Nuremberg in Germany. But then, the chemical map shifted. It showed a movement westward. As she grew into a young girl, the water she drank carried the signature of the French-German border, or perhaps the rolling hills of French-speaking Belgium. This was a child of a continent on the brink of collapse, moving through a landscape that would soon be scarred by war. This scientific map matched the whispers left behind in her handwriting. When experts looked again at the elegant, flowing script in her coded notebooks, they saw the ghosts of a French education. The way she shaped her letters, the tilt of her hand, it all pointed to a schoolroom in the West. This was a woman who spoke German with ease, but who wrote with the soul of a French national. In 2017 and 2018, researchers even managed to extract her DNA. They traced her matrilineal line, her mother's heritage, back to the genetic group known as H24. This signature is rare, pointing toward ancestors from the southeast of Europe or the southwest of Asia. Yet, despite these digital fingerprints, despite the chemical maps of her childhood travels, her name remained a void. The global databases, vast and interconnected, offered no match. No family came forward to claim the woman from Nuremberg. No childhood friend recognized the sketches created by forensic artists. It was as if she had been born of the earth and returned to it without ever truly belonging to a single person. The investigation in 2016 gave her a geography, but it could not give her a heart. It could not tell us who she loved, or why she carried 13 different names like a heavy suit of armor. Today, if you were to visit the Mollendal Cemetery in Bergen, you would find a quiet corner where the grass grows thick and green, dampened by the near-constant Norwegian rain. Somewhere beneath that soft earth lies a zinc coffin. It was chosen so many years ago because it would not rust, because it would protect her remains in case the world ever found a way to identify her. There is no headstone with a name, only the memory of the mystery. The Isdal Valley, the place they call Death Valley, remains as beautiful and as lonely as it was on that cold morning in 1970. The wind still whistles through the pines, and the gray rocks are slick with mist. When the sun sets behind the mountains, the shadows stretch long and dark across the spot where she was found. We may never know if she was a spy caught in a web of international intrigue, or a lonely soul seeking the ultimate disappearance. Perhaps she was both. The science of isotopes has brought us closer to her childhood, but her ending remains locked in the silence of the valley. She has become a part of the landscape now, a legend woven into the mist and the stone. The weight of the mystery is heavy, but here, in the quiet of the night, we can let it go. We have walked the path from the soot-stained rocks to the sterile labs of the future. We have looked at the wigs, the codes, and the chemical echoes in her teeth. We have sought the truth, and while the truth remains elusive, there is a certain peace in the seeking. The Isdal Woman is no longer just a cold case. She is a reminder of the secrets we all carry, and the way the earth remembers us even when the world forgets. The fire that claimed her has long since gone cold. The questions that haunted the investigators have softened into the background noise of history. We leave her there, in the quiet cemetery, in the zinc coffin that holds her secrets fast. The rain will continue to fall over Bergen, washing over the stones, and the fog will continue to roll in from the sea, blanketing the valley in a soft, white shroud. There is nothing left to uncover tonight. The puzzles are put away. The code is closed. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.